Welcome to Remix EQ Live, woo, where we are amplifying equity with a mix of information, interviews, and inspiration. I'm your host, Dr. Erica Tate, and today I'm live from Savannah, Georgia, where I live. For those who are joining us today, please drop a greeting of choice. Hello, howdy, hey, hey. Let us know where you are joining from and the equity work that you are doing or aspire to do. And remember, Remix EQ Live is an experience that's meant to be shared. So I encourage you to hit the share button and invite your people, your network, your family, your crew to join us. So while those comments are flowing in and those invitations are flowing out, I want to remind you that Remix EQ Live offers the opportunity to connect and build community around the equity work that's being performed throughout the world. And we do this by centering the work. That is, our guests share examples of what they need, what they do in their role or position as a way to illustrate how they advance equity in the spaces in which they work and live. So we invite you to do the same throughout the show in our comments. Now, let's kick off this remix. Today, I have my extraordinary guests, Tesmerelna Atsbeha and Dr. Angela DeBarger. I've known these women for a long time. Tesmer, my entire adult life. We went to undergrad at Brown. We've shared maternity clothes. And Angela and I have known each other for nearly a decade, and we've gotten to collaborate together, which just brings me such great joy. And I'm always trying to figure out how to do it. So this shows just like a little bit of that. So I'm excited for them to both be here. And what I also know about these two women is that they were rocking it in different careers before they entered into philanthropy. And so I wanted to cue this up for those in our audience who are exploring where else their career may take them in terms of greater scope or impact. So, Tesmer and Angela, as you introduce yourself, I also invite you to share how your career led you into the philanthropy space. We'll start with you, Tesmer. Welcome.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Erica. Thanks. This is so exciting to be together here. This is my first time doing this kind of show, so it's like a very exciting thing for me. As ET says, Erica said, I'm Tesmerelna Atsbeha, or Tez, and I have been working in private philanthropy for going on 7 years. I'm currently a senior program officer at a foundation, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. And I work in the women's rights or gender justice space. So how I got into philanthropy, I actually worked in the global health or global public health field for about 15 years. I was based in Eastern and Southern Africa for almost 10 years, working on different research and sexual reproductive health programs, mostly as a program manager. And then I came back to the US and was working as a policy advisor at UN Women. And those were really rich experiences. And I was also looking for a little bit of a change in sort of perspective and I had been doing a lot of consulting too, or providing technical advice. And I wanted to be able to be in a little bit more of a kind of a viewpoint that would give me more of a sense of making decisions and being able to kind of be part of sort of systemic work instead of more organizational or sort of operational and implementation work. So that's how I wanted to make this shift to philanthropy. And I think it is actually, for a lot of folks who work in international development, or international public health, it is a really good or possible pivot or transition, because there's a lot of carryover, particularly if you have more of a research background. I did my training in public health. And so that is very helpful because, decision making, a lot of it is doing some assessment or analysis of information or data, and making determinations based on that. And then also program management is a lot of relationship management, right? And that is a lot of what the work of grant making is managing relationships. So in that way, I think that there's a lot of transferability of skills between those different career paths. So that's more or less my story.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited. Angela.
Yeah, so I'm currently a program officer in education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I've been at Hewlett now for about 4.5 years. And really what motivated my interest and work in education to start with is, I think, because I grew up in a family of educators. My mom was an elementary teacher for her whole career, and my dad started out as a high school math teacher and basketball coach, and then worked for many years as an administrator. And I saw how much that they gave and they cared for the students and families they worked with, and how much they were loved in return. And actually, my dad's still in touch with players from this basketball team that he coached back in 1976, which is pretty cool. So I grew up with this sense that education is about giving and caring for others, connecting with others. And in my work, I wanted to figure out how to create spaces where students can discover this sense of connection and discover sense of themselves and a sense of joy and purpose. And so my entry point in was really through educational psychology. And I was curious about how to create classrooms where this kind of experience is possible. And I went to graduate school. I worked for about a decade as a researcher. And as a researcher, I was dependent on grant funds. And part of me really enjoyed that process of coming up with new ideas and writing the proposals. But over time, like that kind of gets wearing, like the constant churn of grant writing. And I wondered what it would feel like to be on the other side. And like Tesmer said, like how decisions are made and how to think of and opportunities to sort of work more systemically. And so now at Hewlett, what I really enjoy is that I get to collaborate with and support an ecosystem of organizations, from curriculum developers to state systems, really focused on helping to create the conditions for deeper and more equitable learning.
Thank you so much. I enjoy very much listening to how you guys have pivoted into this space. So for those who are just joining us, this is Remix EQ Live. And so we are amplifying equity through a mix of information, interviews, and inspiration. And Tesmer and Angela, you have shared with us how you've entered into philanthropy. And so we want to know what you do in your role. Like, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis? So Tesmer, in your role as a senior program officer in philanthropy, how do you advance equity in communities as it relates to women and girls?
So I think, in philanthropy in general, but specifically in the gender justice field, how we do the work is just as important as who we fund or what we fund. And that's, I think, a big part of it. And, just to acknowledge, when we're talking about equity and philanthropy, that philanthropy is really the result of massive accumulation of wealth because of, inequitable systems. And those systems are rooted in neocolonialism and white supremacy, and those are very much tied up into gender inequality as well. No surprise there, I think. And so doing this, I always think about like a reparative model, and how to do repair for the harm that has been caused by these systems for generations, and thinking about creating conditions for healing from that repair. And that is sort of like a little bit of a mind shift or mindset shift for how to think about power when doing this work, and sort of trying to get what Adrienne Maree Brown, I don't know if you follow from Emergent Strategy, talks about getting in right relationship. And I think that's where I think of a lot of this work. It's like trying to get into right relationship between the ecosystem and who's, sort of who has the power within the ecosystem. And so a couple of ways in which I try to think about this. I mean, one is just paying attention to things, and like we in research, you say like the things you measure, what you measure matters, right? And what you pay attention to matters, and who is resourced and who is making decisions matters. And one of the great sort of abilities that you have in this role is to ask questions, right? To have the power of asking questions. And a lot of that I find in relationship, being able to ask questions and frame questions and trying to understand sort of, well, how does this work? And who is leading this? And where are, let's say, community members in this model or in this, project that's being proposed? And what role do those most affected by this, or those who are the beneficiaries, as it's often, kind of framed, play. And I think that, in terms of our internal systems, when you're working in a foundation, just having a tracking of sort of how many resources are going to, let's say, white-led institutions, or how many resources are going to research institutions that are based in the US or in Europe, instead of research institutions that are based in the, in my case, Latin America or East Africa or Southern Africa. And then also looking at and asking questions about, the sort of governance structures that exist. So for programs like, who's on the board of your organization, and is this representative of the communities that, where the organization is based? And that, those sometimes lead to hard conversations, and it's sort of being in the right, kind of developing that trust and the ability to ask those questions and be able to really engage folks. So there's an understanding of like why you're asking the question, and also that it's a journey, and that there isn't an expectation that things, that you need the right answer, but more just I want to understand more of like, how did this come to be that there is no one from this community on this? And, how can we think differently about the way that particularly work that's considered technical work is really understood. And then I think that we also, in terms of doing the work, I also think a lot about like policy shifts, instead of leaving it just to individuals. So, as an individual grant maker, I can try to do my, play my role and do my work as an individual in a specific way. But if there isn't actually a policy change in the way that the work is done across, not just within my institution, but then in other institutions, when I go, that will be lost, or that will not stay, and a lot of that change. So thinking about working together with other partners. And I think one of the great things that I've learned is sort of the power of working with peers in other foundations to push for some, collective change. So we, to push for common grant applications and more flexible funding for grantees and longer term funding. And, we may face our individual barriers, but if we come together and push for this together collectively, we're able to make change, and then that change has a much larger impact. So those are just some of the ways in which we think about it. And there's so many ways. And I often think like, there are times when you can feel like, okay, there's nothing that I can really do, but actually even some of the really small ways in which to institute, change, even just thinking about how the interactions that we have with individual grantees, and being open and coming with your full self. Sometimes, that means like showing up and saying, hey, here's the personal situation that I'm dealing with, and I'm a human being. I'm not just a funder. And I have this, this very, also, intersectional life. And that oftentimes sets the tone with grantees for them to be open to share, I'm also having this challenge, and I actually need this accommodation in order to make it possible for me to do the work. And I think that is an important shift. And though it seems micro, it's actually really important for changing the dynamics and the power relations, and making it possible for folks who are coming from really different situations to be able to do their best work. And that is a definite, complete lesson learned from working throughout the pandemic. But I think it also really applies when you're thinking about equity, because there's so many different dimensions of it in this case. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh, your days sound wonderful. Like, wonderful in the sense that, like, just from the fact, like, the questions that you're asking, the interactions that you're having, all are these ways to shift power and with the people and the communities that you're working with. So no, thank you. There was like so much in there. I'm like, and approaches to this work, and kind of respecting the communities. And I love what you said at the beginning, like this reparative approach to what has happened before. So thanks. Oh my gosh. Okay, Angela. Yeah. So in your role, you're an education program officer at Hewlett Foundation. So how does your work lead to more equity in education?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to start by saying everything Tesmer shared resonates with me so deeply. The ideas about how you work being just as important as the what, and like taking the time, prioritizing listening, and following the field, following communities and where they see the work needing to go. And that point you made too about prioritize, like it's not just about the technical work. We can get really caught up in like the technical details of what needs to happen, but those relational element and building relationships and connecting with others personally is so important in the work that we do too. So thank you for that. And for me, so my work and area of focus is in education and open education specifically. So broadly speaking, open education is about making sure education is accessible, it's affordable, centered on care, and it's really about democratizing learning and making sure we're preparing students to be creative leaders. So as a core part of this, my work focuses on the development and effective use of open educational resources or OER. And so for those who might not be familiar with what OER are, these are materials that are free for educators and students to use, adapt, and share. And they're kind of like open source software, but for classroom materials. And because they have an open license, they can be more easily customized to engage students in content that's relevant and current. And so we work with teams who use OER to create more equitable learning experiences. And they're more equitable, not only because the materials are free and open, but also because they make it possible for students to have access to the resources that they need to learn. And the teams we work with are also intentional about not only designing these kinds of open and flexible materials to address ambitious learning goals, but also trying to think about how we can create them in ways that are culturally responsive and supporting teachers in developing skills where they can facilitate these conversations about how students' identities and interests and backgrounds connect with the content that they're learning in school. And of course, we want this kind of learning to be possible across classrooms and schools. So we also partner with school districts and state systems to make sure that we have those supportive conditions in place, like so that teachers and faculty have opportunities for professional learning, and so that there are policies that actually encourage the adoption and this kind of use of open educational resources and support deeper learning and connections with community and family. So in my role, I get to think about equity from the classroom level all the way to the system level with open educational resources as one key piece of the puzzle to help address some of the inequities we see in education systems.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Oh man. And so I mean, I just love it. I mean, there's so many like aspects, and I love like both like that systems approach and thinking. I think both in you and with Tesmer and Angela, both of you guys talked about like changing the policies that go along with the work that you're doing. So I want to shift a little bit and talk about diversity in terms of representation and philanthropy. So in the past, I did not always link philanthropy and diversity in terms of professionals like working in the field. And those who have had a different experience than that, please share with us. But for me, I always associate like this idea of philanthropy with like old money and white money or new tech money. And I know the field's changing, and I know the face is changing because over the years, I've met more professionals of color in the field. And that's like one of the reasons I wanted to remix you guys together was because you were probably the first two Black women that I knew, like in a real way, who were working in this space. And that you're grant makers and change makers. And I was like, they have to know each other, but I also want to learn more about the work that they're doing and what's involved. And you guys do this against this backdrop of a field that's like changing in terms of who's being represented and the practices that are changing because they have historically been inequitable. And so my next question is for both of you. What is your experience navigating the field of philanthropy as a Black woman? And we'll start with you, Angela.
Yeah. Well, my personal experience is I haven't seen that many Black women in philanthropy, although I think our numbers are growing, which is very encouraging. Personally, though, it feels very familiar to me. Like I'm used to being the only one or one of a few Black women in school settings and in prior work settings. But I'm hopeful that that is changing. Um, when I reflect on the question, it makes me think about being in philanthropy. It's helped me realize, I think, more than some of the other positions I've held. And I don't know if that's because of the responsibility that comes with the financial resources, but it makes me think, it makes me realize I really have a responsibility to use my voice in ways that recognize the importance of the lived experiences of people of color, and to bring attention to systemic inequities and find ways to work with communities of educators and learners to figure out what really needs to change. And so I personally have made the intentional decision to prioritize racial equity as a core part of the work that I do as a funder. And we've made that case formally for our work in the open education strategy. And also, when I reflect on this question, in my experience, especially these past years, I've come to realize that my personal voice matters too. And at Hewlett, program officers have a lot of autonomy. And I think for the first time, compared to any other role I've been in, I felt empowered to do things in ways that allow me to bring my full self to the role and to demonstrate leadership in ways that make sense to me as a Black woman and that are fulfilling to me. And so that feels really good to be in a place where that's possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think is a really interesting question to reflect on, because I think within, philanthropy is a big field, and there's a lot of diversity in the, I would say, in the public foundation side of philanthropy. There's actually quite a lot of Black women in leadership roles, especially like leading Ms. Foundation and other foundations, Borealis and others. And that's really exciting, and that's been happening over, I think, the last 10 or so years, and really, I think, represents a big shift in the field. In private philanthropy, however, I think that that's a slower change. And in my own institution, in the time that I've been there has been an incredible shift, and almost like the face of the institution is completely different, and that's been really exciting to watch. And it's also a challenge, though, because, and this is like to reflect back on our time at Brown, Erica. I think one of the things I learned at Brown was that, representation or diversity does not necessarily always equal to inclusion, right? And that, I think, is a challenge of what has to change, like how is the institution going to be able to change to make it possible for everyone to be able to really show up as their full selves and work there and feel that there's psychological safety, and that it's a space that really is, like a sense of belonging in that space. And I think that is a challenge, and it's work that does require some real attention to, and some real effort. And I've been part of the change efforts at my own institution and learned a lot from those processes. And I think a big part of that is when you're in private philanthropy, often the resources are coming from the private part of the economy, right? Where like and those sort of ways of working that have like more inclusive sort of decision making and inclusive leadership, or leadership that is more kind of thinking about equity and inclusion as part of the mandate of leadership, are still evolving, I think, and that's a challenge. I think one of the ways in which I've reflected is like to be in this there's a dichotomy to be in a role where you do have quite a lot of power, and to also be in situations where, because of your identity, you feel like you are in a somehow less empowered or in a different, situation, or having to kind of like prove more than maybe other white colleagues in particular, or male colleagues, to get the same work done, or to get the same sort of level of trust. That there are tensions there, to be very honest. And I think there are a lot of opportunities because, as Angela was saying, when you are supported and do feel empowered to be able to show up as your full self, there's just so much more that comes from, there's so many opportunities. And I think it actually is like really inspiring. And so I think about, within where I work, Black women leaders who really help me kind of feel emboldened at different moments when they show up, and when they're in their full selves and saying, okay, like I also, need to give myself permission at times to really, to be my full self. And that sort of finding your superpower is really a big part of that. I mean, another thing that I'm really grateful for, that I think is showing up more is spaces that are particularly like supportive spaces specific to, Black and Indigenous or people of color, that are learning spaces for folks working in the sector, that are away from the white gaze, that give you a chance to just like nourish yourself and like just think about how you can like build up your your capacity, and where you can be vulnerable, and where you can like talk through challenges that you have. And so whether that's just with another individual person, whether that's having a coach, which I think is a really important resource for everyone. I would say coaching is amazing, and if you can have a coach, particularly one that has a deep understanding of equity issues, like it's a game changer. And then also we have within Funders for Reproductive Equity, which is an affinity group, we have a BIPOC learning community. And I find that to be such a valuable space to just, feel really, at home, and be able to share some challenges and talk through. And it's really not, it's not really about necessarily the work. It's about your whole self, and being able to kind of ensure that your whole self is healthy, because you can't do the work unless you tend to the full self. And so that's, I think that's an important part as we're like thrust into doing these roles, and playing all of these different, showing up in these different ways in these different spaces, that is so important to remember that you have to kind of like tend to all the parts of yourself. And especially like during the pandemic, like the tired and frazzled parent, which is where I feel like I show up almost every day. So.
Oh, thank you guys for sharing like your personal like experiences as well, because I appreciate that so much, but also how your institutions are changing, or places outside of your institution that are connecting you across, organizations to support the work that you do, because it is so important, and we need your voice at the table, or the tables, wherever they are, to really help bring projects and initiatives into fruition that are going to make the change. And so throughout the conversation, you guys have dropped knowledge about like your work, your experience in philanthropy. I mean, I feel like I know like 10,000 more things than I did when we started the show. And that's what the show's about, right? Like I want people to leave with more knowledge about like the different pathways and possibilities for advancing equity in communities that matter the most to them. And the show's also about dropping inspiration. And if we can even handle any more inspiration, I do want to close out our show just segment, kind of making sure we all stay inspired to make the world a more just place. And so, Angela, just like in a minute or less, what inspires you most about supporting projects that advance equity in education?
Yeah, well, I'm super inspired when I see students leading and shaping the kind of learning that they want to see, and like whether that's the level of a classroom project where they're exploring their interests and what motivates them, or whether they're like advocating for better policies and practices at their school or even the state and federal level. I guess the other thing I'd highlight that inspires me is when I see collaboration in the field and commitment to really living into learning together. and building an evidence base that involves partnerships with practitioners and researchers where we're co-designing questions and approaches and really living into the openness and sharing and what we're learning along the way.
I love it. I love it. And Tesmer, what excites you about the future of philanthropy and the role it will play in advancing equity in communities throughout the world?
Oh, there's so much exciting work that's happening right now. I mean, there's just, as Angela's referenced, there's so many collaborations and like new ways of working and new kind of approaches to the work. There's been, a Black feminist fund that was launched last year, which is really pulling together some analysis, some, Black feminism's analysis that's transnational and linking folks in Brazil and, other parts of Latin America with folks that are, part of the movement for Black lives in the US, and like this really dynamic work that's really shaping and kind of reimagining what's possible and really coming from places of, wellness and healing and joy and not from scarcity or absence or lack. And I think that's, something that really inspires me. And also just to see the levels at which, in my field in gender justice, there have been these massive shifts of, legalization of abortion and Latin America is just like shifting the landscape incredibly. And that is all young feminists who are leading that and, who are in the streets, but also in the parliament. And so I think it's like the idea that all of this, like, is happening and it's having this impact at such a high level, in national and global spaces is just, it's very inspiring. And I feel like, I hope that there's a lot of other young feminists that are seeing this and thinking, okay, now I'm next and I'm going to be the next one to change my world. So yeah, a lot of great stuff.
Yes, I love that. I'm next. I'm going to be the next one to change my world. Yes, that's like the perfect note to end on. Yes, awesome. Thank you, Tesmer, Angela, so much for taking time out of your busy schedules of changing the world to talk. It's been wonderful. I invite you back so we can continue the conversations. We could remix you with other people and keep going. I'm like, or we could just go out. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I will be back on April 22nd for another interview show. The topic will be education. We'll have Vanola Mason, who is an associate partner and author at the International Center for Leadership and Education, and Michael O'Neill, who is the executive director of Parent University here in Savannah, Georgia, and beyond. And they will be talking with us about the power of building relationships with children and parents in order to advance equity in schools and communities. So please watch your feed, check your inbox so that you have the details to tune in to the next show. And anytime in between, please visit the Remix EQ Live webpage for past episodes, more information about our amazing guests, and any upcoming shows. And while you're there, please feel free to poke around the website and learn more about my business, Blue Knowledge, which advances equity in schools and communities. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. And of course, I invite you to connect with me in this space. Thank you to the Remix EQ Live community for your engagement and your presence that keeps us inspired to make the world a more just place. So I'm your host, Dr. Erica Tate, and this is Remix EQ Live. We'll see you next time.